Do you want to see how we can utilize Godot's particle system to create something like this, or even something better, like the particles coming off a campfire or a sparkle in the sky? Well, keep watching, and we're going to cover the basics and fundamentals of the particle system in Godot. We'll start off by adding in a node to house our particle system. This could be added on top of an existing 3D or 2D scene, or just a standalone like we'll do here. Inside of this, we're going to notice there are two different types of particles. We're going to have the CPU particles 3D and the GPU particles 3D. Now, the main difference here is that the CPU is going to be processed by our CPU, and the GPU ones are going to be processed by the GPU. The other difference is that CPU particles have less flexibility than our GPU counterparts, but can run on a larger range of hardware, so might be more useful for doing things for mobile games or on less powerful computers. GPU particles, on the other hand, are a lot more flexible, but do require the GPU to run, so less powerful machines might not be able to handle them. However, they can use custom shaders for the particles themselves and can render thousands of particles at one time. For our purposes, we're going to go with a GPU particles 3D node, and we're going to insert that into the scene. Now, when we do this, we're going to see there's initially a warning here. And that's because we're missing the two main components that we need to define these particles. And this is going to be the process material and the draw passes, which we can see in the inspector over here on the right. The process material isn't really a material at all. It's going to allow us to tell this particle system how and when we want this thing to update. The draw passes are then going to be what we're actually going to be emitting and what that process is going to look like when we emit them from this system. For this case, we'll just create a new particle process material, and then under our draw passes, we have the different number of passes, and if we wanted to have multiple things being emitted, we can bump this number up, so we can have multiple objects being spit out as opposed to having to have multiple particle systems. By clicking on empty, we can specify the type of mesh that we want to emit. In our case, we'll go with just a sphere mesh so we can see it. Now, the second I have the process material and my draw pass defined, we'll start to see it spitting out of our emitter. At this point, we can start to customize this and get it to do exactly what we're looking for. I mentioned previously that these GPU particles are a lot more flexible than our CPU counterparts, but if we ever needed to convert back to CPU particles, at the top of our viewport, we can convert this to that. Now, we do lose a couple of options here, things like our turbulence, our trail, and then any multiple draw passes that we have, but we do have that option to convert it backwards. The key settings we want to focus on are all in the inspector, and that's where we're going to be making a lot of the changes. First and foremost, we have emitting. Toggle on and off, and when we turn it on, we'll actually see the particles. When we turn it off, it will stop. The amount right below that is going to be the total number of physical particles that we see on the screen at any given time. So ours is set to 8, so we will see those 8. If I then increase this to 16 and enter that in, we're going to see more of those particles being spit out. Moving down to the time section, we have a lot of options here, but more importantly, we have this lifetime, and that's going to be how long that these particles are going to exist on screen in our scene before they disappear. So if I want to make them last a little bit longer, I can put that to 2, but we'll notice that the rate that the particles are coming out is going to slow down a little bit. And that's because the way that the particles per second is calculated is going to be the amount that we set up here divided by the lifetime. So we're doing 16 particles, lifetime of 2 seconds. That's going to give me 8 particles a second. A little further down, we have the speed scale. If we set that to 0, it's going to pause my particles. If I set it to 2, they're going to move twice as fast. And we can use that to control how this is going to appear in our scene. We then have the value for explosiveness here, and we have a range between 0 and 1. If 0 is set, they're all going to go one right after the other in a normal interval. However, if we set that to 1, it's just going to emit all of my particles at one time. And this could be useful for things like an explosion, where we want all the particles to come out at once as opposed to trailing. And if I set it to something like 0.5, we're going to see them start to come out a little bit closer together, but not completely all at once. And then finally in this section, we have randomness. Again, a 0 to 1, but if I set it to 1, the time interval between when these particles are being emitted is going to be completely random. Something like 0.5 is going to be a little bit less random, and then 0 will be a completely even interval between them. So like a lot of these settings, we can tweak them to get a lot of control over how we want this to go. The remaining settings here are going to be covered in a later video where we go into the advanced options and what we can do, but we can specify things for collision, how we want them to draw, and then finally our trails. Before we get any further in this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos. To dive deeper into what we're looking at here with our process material, if I click on that to open it, we have some additional options that are going to allow us to play with our particles. We have things like time, emission shape, the direction, the gravity, our initial, angular, and linear acceleration, things of that nature that we can play with to modify. The key ones here are things like time, where we can set a randomness to the lifetime. So we've set that time value up above here to a specific value, in our case 2, but we can specify a little bit of randomness here. So we can put that to 1, and that will give us a completely random lifetime between 0 and the time we set. The next option down is for an emission shape, and we have a couple different options depending on how we want these particles to be emitted. By default, it's going to be coming out of just the point in the dead center of that particle emitter. If I set this to sphere, and I'll give this a little bit higher of a value so we can see it, it is going to randomly emit the particles in a 3-unit sphere around our particle emitter. We can continually do things like a sphere surface. Maybe it's a box, and we can say that this is going to be a 3 by 3 by 3 box, and they're going to appear randomly inside of that location. We can do points, directed points, and ring, and again, have more control of how we want them to be. So if we're doing something like snow in a scene, maybe we'll do a box that's going to cover our entire scene and have it emit from there. Or maybe we want some sort of sparkle around something, we can use a sphere to get that done. Further down, we have options to set our gravity. By default, it's going to be going just a normal Earth gravity in the -y direction. So as we see, the particles are going to spawn in the middle, and they're going to immediately fall. We can play with this a little bit, and if we set this to 0, once all my other particles clear, we're going to get no movement here. They're just going to stay static, and I could do something like a -1 in the X, and we're going to see they're going to transition that way. So depending on how we want this to appear, maybe this is the particles coming off a jet engine. We want them to just kind of float off to the left. Maybe we want them to go up and to the left. We can do that here with our gravity as well. I'll just set this to 0 and 0 here so we can take a look and see at the next couple options and how they're going to affect this. And that next section is the initial velocity here, where we can specify a minimum and maximum value for our velocity. And I'll say from 1 to 5. And these are going to start to emit in the direction that we set above gravity. In our case, it's going in the X direction for a unit of 1, but I can start to play with this as well. And maybe we want them to go up and to the right, and they're going to start to emit using that random value between our velocity min and our velocity max. And we can do the same thing for our angular velocity, the linear and radial acceleration, and we can control how these are being emitted. So in this case, it's going to start to go off to the right in a random value with this spread value as well. So the higher the spread, the more randomness in the direction that we're going to go. And if I set this to 0, they're all just going to go in that 45-degree angle up into the right of our screen. The last thing I want to point out here is the scale, because maybe in this case we're doing bubbles coming out of a bubble gun or off of a bubble bath. All the bubbles aren't going to be the exact same size. So we can specify a min and a max value of the scale for our draw pass, and we can see that they're going to start to vary in size between 0.1 scale and 2 scale for those bubbles. And I'll even knock this down to 0.5, and we can see that a little bit better, where we're going to have some small bubbles, some big bubbles, and if we want to control that even further, we can create a curve for that. And I can start to play with these values, add in points, and we'll start to have more or less of a certain size bubble. Now finally, we can turn our attention to what we're actually emitting here. And like I mentioned, we can have multiple passes, and GPU particles has a maximum of 4, and each one can contain its own mesh. And if we go and edit one of these meshes, we can start to specify these values. So mine's just a sphere. Maybe we want to go with something more like an oval. We can change that, and pretty much instantly we'll see it on screen. We can then apply materials to this too, whether we want it to just be a standard material, and then I can start to change things about this. So I can change the albedo. Maybe we want to make these a little bit of a orangish red. We can make them a little bit more metallic. And we can play with this just like we can any other material here inside of Godot. If I wanted to add in an additional pass, it's really just as easy as adding another one in and then assigning its own mesh. So I can put a little box mesh there and we can start to see that it's going to merge these two together and emit them at one time. At this point, if I'm satisfied with how everything looks, well, I can save this and I can insert it into my scenes. So now when I play my scene here and I have my character moving around, we can see that these particles are going to be emitted as if they were coming out of something, whether it's like campfire, a bubble gun, whatever we're using for these particles, we can drive them. The final thing I want to point out here is that all of these settings and all of these properties can be interacted with by code. So for example, we have the emitting, and we can set this value to either true or false to have it emit at a certain time. So maybe we want dust particles to kick up from our player's feet. We can have that be done through code and ensure that we can only see it when we're on the ground and we're moving.